Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I am joined by Garin Hess, co-founder and CEO of Consensus. Garin's name may ring familiar as he was on a PreSales Collective webinar where we talked around buyer enablement. I'm also a big fan of his book, Selling is Hard, Buying is Harder, as I feel like it has a lot of synergies with customer centricity. So Garin and I have had a number of conversations around these types of topics. So today's episode, we talk about scaling presales. Scaling presales is a fundamental problem within our profession. What does scaling mean? What resources should we be throwing at deals? What type of activities should we be doing in deals? All of these questions come into when it comes to scale. And what does scale actually mean? In today's episode, Garin and I are going to talk about these subjects. I think you'll really like what Garin has to say. He puts a lot of really interesting thoughts out there and some good actionable takeaways. So enjoy today's episode. Hey, Garin. Good afternoon.
Hey, James. How's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Yourself?
Doing great. Thanks. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. I'm excited to have you on the PreSales Podcast today. I mean, this is just another chance for us to have a conversation and for me to further pick your brain on all things pre-sales. I'm excited for it.
I'm really impressed with what you guys are doing at the PreSales Collective. I mean, you've got the webinar series, you've got your forums, you've got the podcast now. I know you're doing an executive summit event here pretty soon. So kudos to you guys for pulling the community together. It's fun, fun to watch.
Thanks, Garin. I appreciate it. I mean, I think we're all trying to fight the same battle and just help elevate the brand of pre-sales and continue to make sure we have a seat at the table and the resources. And we'll talk about things that you guys are doing at Consensus. I think it's a great time for pre-sales generally. And I'm really happy that PreSales Collective can help be a vehicle for change of the platform.
Yeah, it's exciting to see the pre-sales community come together because for so long it's kind of been overlooked and just kind of sidelined a little bit. And it's not just that element of it, but it's really bringing best practices to the forefront to kind of elevate the entire profession, which is gratifying to see so many people coming together to try to share and elevate the best practices.
So Garin, before we get into today's topic of scaling pre-sales, I do want to talk to you real quick about your book because we did a PreSales Collective webinar. I told you I read that book in 2 days. I loved it. I've talked a lot about customer centricity, and I thought a lot of the alignment on buyer enablement was great. And your book actually joined the top 100 in sales and sales management on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
congratulations.
Pretty exciting. Yeah, thank you very much. Selling is hard, buying is harder. It was a research effort for a couple of years. It's been exciting to have it out there and getting some really good feedback on it. So I'm glad to see it's being well received.
You have to probably feel really validated that all the hard work that you spent years on to make this book come to reality is really coming to fruition.
It is really gratifying to see and is validating. As you know, and we've spoken about before, that having a focus on the buyer journey and having buyer empathy and really understanding the buyer's experience and trying to make that process easier for them really helps everybody. It not only helps the buyer, but interestingly enough, it helps all of us close deals faster and more effectively and builds just better relationships. So the whole focus on enabling the buyer rather than focusing on enabling salespeople, let's say, is going to help everybody all around.
And that's great. I love that fundamental shift. I got to ask you a quick question on this, though. When did you start utilizing the term buyer enablement?
Yeah, it's funny because Gartner thinks that they coined the term. I suppose it's possible, but we started writing about buyer enablement back in, I think, as early as 2014, 2015.
Okay. Wow.
At one point, we were calling it buyer acceleration. I don't remember, but I think the term buyer enablement we started using in 2015 and some of our initial blog articles. So it's been a while, and it really came out of this experience with our software. So when we built our demo automation software and we started using it ourselves, what stood out to me right away was how the interactive video demos would be shared and often discover and engage other stakeholders. All of a sudden, it occurred to me that this is the bigger value. Like the fact that somebody can watch an interactive video demo is great, but even better is when they share it with other people and you find and discover those hidden stakeholders. And I started thinking, wow, what we're really doing is putting tools in the hands of that champion to go sell internally. When it first started jumping out at me, and then I just began doing research on it, and over the years gathered that research, and it just finally came together this year to get it out the door.
That's fantastic. So speaking of, having buyer enablement come together and scaling pre-sales, funny thing that I realized today actually is I sent you a message on LinkedIn because I was writing something around buyer enablement, customer centricity. And I looked through our chat history. I realized that you and I went back and forth in early 2018, where you messaged me and said, "Hey, James, I know you're at Showpad. We're doing some research on buyer enablement and doing some things on scaling pre-sales. Would you be willing to give us some feedback?" And I looked, and you sent me something from early 2018, and we had a slight back and forth. And then unfortunately, and I apologize, I didn't respond with the feedback. And then I just looked because we've obviously gotten
how interesting
the last couple of months, but I wanted to let you know that today.
I had forgotten about that. Yeah, that was some initial, we just surveyed a lot of different people, had some primary research interviews with key people in the industry, asking them about buyer enablement and getting their perspective on a bunch of questions. So I'm sure that's what that was all about.
Yeah, here we are, 2.5 years later. So doing a podcast. How did you stumble into the world of pre-sales?
Well, I've been involved in the enterprise software industry my whole career, even before I was a tech entrepreneur. And I got involved in pre-sales early on. I was working for a enterprise software company up in Vancouver, Washington, early in my career, and I was an installer. At the time, it was all local networks. So we'd go out on site, install these local networks, run everything, and train them on how to do it. And I just made it one of my goals to become the best source of knowledge on the software in the company. And they had these 2 user manuals that were like 1,500 pages each. And I actually read the entire thing and then made this whole game about the content, and then started these games inside the company to try to elevate the knowledge about the software, because it was really deep and complex. And because I had that knowledge, I started getting pulled into these sales conversations. We don't know how to answer this question. Let's go get Garin. He knows what's going on. And they didn't have an official sales engineering role at that point in that company. But I started playing that role. Then when they did start bringing sales engineers in, I had to train them on how to be effective sales engineers, which was this combination of consulting and knowledge. And so that was really my first introduction in my 20s to sales engineering. So I kind of played this role as sales engineer at that company and then trained these sales engineers. And then just as a tech entrepreneur, over the last many years, I'm constantly pulled into conversations about how to solve for solutions, right? The customer's got a problem. They want to know if our platform can help, and how can it help, and in what ways can we configure it, and things like that. And are there any custom elements and all of that, which is really that role of sales engineering. And what I realized over time, which all of you already know, is just that it's almost impossible to get really important deals done without the sales engineering component. Yeah. And yet it's really hard to find people that can do that effectively. And it often creates this bottleneck. Even in the companies that I've started, it has sometimes been a bottleneck, and I've had to jump in and play that role, right? And so I've long since wanted to solve that. And not only about the consulting part, but the demoing part. So I remember my last startup, there's just one day when I was just doing demo after demo, because our sales team was totally slammed, and I did 6 demos back to back, and I was exhausted. And they were all these harbor cruise demos, as they say, just the standard demos. I was just thinking, that was the worst use of my time, this entire year. And that's where the kind of the genesis of demo automation started. We really didn't know how to solve it back then. We were throwing up videos on YouTube, screen recordings, WebEx recordings, stuff like that. But it was really that pain of just, how do we handle this? We were making these trade-offs sometimes, like, who do we demo to? We can't demo to everybody. Yeah. And I just realized that this was a big bottleneck. And if it was for me, it was probably for a lot of companies.
That's great perspectives, Garin. And as we get into today's topic of scaling pre-sales, the first question I was going to ask you is pretty much, why did you start Consensus? Because, Consensus is gaining traction with quite a few pre-sales organizations. And what you mentioned about demo and demo automation helping be a gatekeeper essentially to your pre-sale resource sounds really interesting. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about demo automation generally?
So one of the big challenges with demos is just qualified demos, for example. And you think about, we have all these gates for leads, such as a marketing qualified lead, a sales accepted lead, a sales qualified lead, a qualified opportunity. But a lot of organizations just run pell-mell into grabbing pre-sales resources anytime without too much thought about the qualification. And in fact, our workload and compensation survey on sales engineering that we did earlier this year shows that half of the industry said that 30% or more of their demos are unqualified. And
that's a lot.
1 in 5 said 50% of their demos were unqualified. So, I mean, there's just a massive challenge in terms of productivity and efficiency. And again, I saw that in our own organization, but as we started surveying people and understanding that, it really came to the forefront. It had just become a passion to try to make it not only a better experience inside the organization to more effectively use pre-sales resources, but also make for a better customer experience. So kind of going to this qualification issue, we came up with this demo qualified lead concept, which is a DQL. We need a stage in there that is a gate through which the leads have to pass before we engage with a sales engineer. And that will help decrease the number of unqualified demos. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, but that gives you some sense about it.
So that's really interesting, Garin, for sure. For you, it sounds like today's topic of scaling pre-sales, this idea of the qualified lead or the lack thereof, getting to the pre-sales team seems to be a bit of the genesis of the idea of scaling pre-sales. Is that accurate? Why are you so interested in the term of scaling pre-sales?
I'm just very passionate about two things: business effectiveness and efficiency in general, and also about customer experience. And when I look at the highest point of leverage in a go-to-market organization, the sales engineering function is the highest point of leverage. Every sales engineer services, on average, 4 account executives. So if you can effectively help that sales engineering function scale, then you're really affecting the whole organization. But it's not only about that, it's about creating a better buying experience and ultimately about the whole buyer enablement concept, which is to make buying easier, right? So the easier you can make the purchase, the more likely you will at getting the purchase. There are just a lot of different reasons that scaling pre-sales is inherently difficult. Initially, there's the sales training mismatched. Salespeople can be trained really quickly. Sales engineers take sometimes 2 or 3 years to really become super effective. There's multilingual market coverage. There's going down market where volume is higher and you need a lower touch sales model. And just this concept of the unqualified and the wasted demos. And the thing that really interests me is trying to create space, both literal additional time and mental space for sales engineers to do what they do best. So I've talked to a lot of sales engineers and they get demotivated, frustrated with all these standard demos they have to do, just like I had. It was that pain that I had. It was just like, that was a waste of my whole day. And it's never a waste. I mean, you're doing something. I mean, you're showing somebody your product, but it feels like a waste.
It does. We cringe at that, right? The idea of like, just going to sit there and do a bunch of standard stuff all day long.
It's like I'm a highly trained expert and I'm just going through this thing. The standard person could do it. In fact, in Europe, they call it a parrot, a demo parrot, which is kind of funny. It's like, wah, wah, wah. Yeah, none of us feel like doing that. And so I have this desire, I guess, to go even deeper. I believe in unlocking the potential of individuals. My greatest desire is to contribute in this world in a way to help people achieve their highest potential in a variety of ways, whether I'm rearing my children or in my profession. And in my profession, I want sales engineers to have the opportunity to reach their highest potential. Well, the highest potential is not doing repetitive demos all day long. It's leveraging the expertise to provide consulting and solutions and doing those deep dive technical demos. It's not only just to be a more effective sales engineer, but it's about quality of life. I really believe that when you have a great work experience, your whole family or personal life is a better experience, right? What you bring home from work. So, I agree. I mean, I don't talk about the side of it very often, but those are sort of the deeper visceral reasons that I'm passionate about the subject.
Yeah, no, those are great, Garin. Like those are bulletin board materials. Like I feel like we need people in the pre-sales collective to write those down because you're right. Like helping people reach potential. And I use the term job affinity a lot. And if we make people continue to do the same thing over and over and don't let them get out of the box and keep them in like a lack of creativity when it comes to the customer, why would you want to do that all day long? Right. And then it's the job affinity. It's like, I don't want to be here. I don't like this. I'm going to look for something else. So I like that you've talked about that generally. So maybe a question around scaling pre-sales effectively is like, what are the core components of being able to scale pre-sales effectively?
At the very beginning, you need to define the gap And I think of it as in two gaps. So there's kind of the demo capacity gap, and then there's what I would call the key activity gap. So when I think about these different types of gaps, the demo capacity gap, another way I talk about it is the increasing demand gap.
Okay.
So how do we handle increasing demand? The increasing demand could come from we're hiring more salespeople, there's more marketing spend, we're going down market and there's more volume. I mean, it could be any number of reasons, or maybe it's been tough and we've had to cut back our team because of the pandemic and the bad economy, and we just have increasing demand on each person that remains on the team. So really the way to deal with the increasing demand gap is to do an analysis of how many hours is required to meet the demand and how many resources do we have, and is there a gap there? Doing things the way we're currently doing them. And so it could be as simple as just what's our AE to SE ratio, and kind of working through a formula in that. And in the ebook I wrote up, there's some details about that, some spreadsheets that might be helpful. And then on the other side is the key activity gap. And this is really goes to, what do you really want your sales engineers to be spending their time on? If you look at all the different things that sales engineers do is, they've got technical demos, POCs, the standard demos, discovery, customer support, consulting calls, improving product knowledge, training and mentoring. They've got planning and architecting, troubleshooting. They get pulled into all kinds of directions, right?
That's not a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's literally impossible to do all of that as effectively. And so the goal really is to say, well, what are the key activities that we want to elevate or magnify and increase? And in what ways can we automate or delegate or even eliminate other activities to be able to create time and space for sales engineers to do more of those key activities?
Yeah.
So that's really the beginning of the process, which is the gap analysis. And then I have just a few other strategies, which is better qualification, categorizing demos so that they align better with the buying process. And we have a webinar, for example, on just 6 different demo types. Equipping sales to demo. So this kind of goes to delegating, and I know which is kind of a scary thought, but there is a question about how to do that. And in our survey, we actually found that about 30% of the industry is already equipping sales to demo. Yeah, in one way or another. Leveraging interactive demo automation, using video for multilingual market coverage, using mass webinars for that people can join. They're not ready to talk to sales. And then really just focusing on KPIs. How do we know if we're making progress and scaling? And I guess one other thing I'll just say about this is just scaling is not hiring. So a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, for example, they'll say, hey, we're scaling now. And what they really mean is we're hiring tons of people.
Yeah.
But that's not true scale. Scale is exponential results from existing resources. And so the question is, how do we get exponential results from the existing resources we have rather than just, oh, we have this gap, let's just hire more people to fill the gap. So that's the way that I kind of think about the scaling pre-sales process.
You just said a lot of really great things there, Garin. So let me pick out a couple, right?
Sorry,
I like the new term of scale, right? Exponential results from existing resources. I actually haven't heard that. That is really interesting because a lot of times you hear startup and you hear scale up, but you're right. Scale up is like companies that are just throwing.
We're going to hire 1,000 people. That's not scaling. That's growing, and it's growing fast. But scaling has to have an exponential component to the mathematical line, right?
That sounds like a podcast episode in its own right there. I like that one. One of the things that you mentioned was the key activity, right? And I think this is something that really resonates with me. And I'm sure those listening, so many times I hear organizations are struggling to define what their SE team should do. And even when you take a step back and you think about that 30+% that have their account executives demoing, you wonder how technical is the product that the AEs can carry this thing 50, 60, 70% of the way. And then you have your SE kind of come in for those finishing touches versus, hey, my AE can only do 5 or 10%. And then you bring the SE in. From my perspective, when I think about demo capacity and key activities, based off the technology complexity and based off the current selling motion, those things tend to switch. And if you have a product where your AE can take this thing a little bit further, you could really buckle down to decide what your SE does beyond just demo jockeys. And there are so many companies that believe, hey, my SE should just be doing demos, but there is so much more from workshop perspectives based off what you said, like what the buyers actually need. I think that that's where our industry needs to continue to shift and to change. And so like, that's why we're talking today is because I really love this concept of demo automation and how it helps there. Question for you, though, that you mentioned that I think is very intriguing. And you talked about a gap analysis. What is a gap analysis and how do you do it?
So the gap analysis is really just defining what you need to accomplish to meet demand. And then do you have the resources to meet that demand? Quite often there's a gap there. So you might calculate out and say, oh, based on demand, we need 50 sales engineers, but we only have 30 sales engineers. So there's a gap of 20 sales engineers effectively. So that's kind of the increasing demand or demo capacity gap analysis. Then, like I said, the key activity analysis really is about defining what are the key activities and then asking yourself that you want to emphasize, and then asking yourself, what would you say no to so that you're going to increase the time your sales engineers spend on their best activities? A lot of times people don't understand the concept of strategy, which I find interesting. In fact, I read a book a while back, which I won't mention because I'll talk about it disparagingly a little bit. The book itself was great, but they had this chapter on strategy. And they said, what is strategy? And they said, strategy is simply the way you go about doing what you do. And I was thinking, that's not strategy. That's like saying your budget is a record of what you spent your money on. That's not a budget. So strategy, in my opinion, can be summed up in one word: trade-offs. If you don't know what you're saying no to, you don't have a strategy. Until you know what you're consciously saying no to, you don't have a strategy. And so right now, a lot of sales engineering organizations don't have a strategy, in my opinion. I'm not trying to diss on sales engineering organizations. Right. They're making great efforts. But the point is they don't ask the question, what am I going to say no to? Because you can't say yes to everything. And the reality is most sales engineering organizations try to say yes to everything. Everybody's requesting them for a demo. Everyone wants them to get in on a troubleshooting conversation. They get pulled in so many different directions. Unless you can say no to some of those things, you can't ever elevate or expand the key activities. So then it comes a question, well, how do you say no? Because you can't really just say no.
I was like, all right, I'm going to ask Garin, how do you say no?
So when I think about how to scale anything, I actually think about this great book by a guy named Rory Vaden called Procrastinate on Purpose, which I think is an intriguing title. And he has this thing called the focus funnel. And it's really about personal productivity, but some of these concepts can be applied to organizational strategy as well. He says basically, when you're looking at all the things you have to do, you have to ask yourself, what can I eliminate? What can I delegate? What can I automate? And then what can I procrastinate on purpose? And so when you get into trying to come up with a strategy, you need to ask yourself, what can I eliminate? So for example, can we eliminate these repetitive demo jockey demos? Well, how do we eliminate them? Well, they have to be done. So you can't just say no. So when I say, what can you say no to? It's not about saying no permanently, like, no, we're not going to do it. Sorry, go find some other way to do it. It's really about providing alternatives. And the two that I talk about the most in the Scaling Presales ebook, one is delegation. So can you create some type of early stage demo that sales can do to satisfy the early type of vision demo or micro demo that they can offer live? The other question is, can you do that in an automated way with something like Consensus, right? Can you provide sales a library of reusable vision and micro demos, even standard, a little bit deeper dive demos, but still general, that they can use? So in that way, you can say, no, we're not doing those. Sales engineers aren't doing those anymore. They are in the sense that they're building the materials, they're building the video demos.
Right.
So they're saying no, and that would free up. And half of the industry says that will free up 30% of sales engineers' time. So, I just asked the question, what would you do with 30% more time for every sales engineer in your organization? I mean,
celebrate.
Yeah. Maybe go home before 10 p.m.
Yeah.
I don't know, but there's so much more that can be done, and you can fill that time with those key activities. Anyway, there's a lot more to go into there, but for now, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Thanks, Garin. And so this has got me thinking, and I want to ask maybe what could be a controversial question. You and I have talked at least live twice in front of audiences, and we've talked plenty of times behind the scenes around these types of things. We talk about customer centricity, buyer enablement, but when you talk about demo automation, maybe it reduces the personal touch. I reach out and then I get sent to this micro portal where I need to watch a video. Perhaps that's like less effective than a live person. So Do you have any opinions on that?
I love this question. I get this a lot. In fact, there's a corollary in my last startup, which was quite a while ago, but it was really in the e-learning world. a lot of corporate training was moving to e-learning, there was always this question of the same thing. Well, you have a live trainer. Can you really train effectively through a computer? And it's a very valid question because we all like to have that personal touch. We like to ask those questions directly and so on. But to answer that, I want to come back with another question because really we're talking about the customer experience. Well, if we ask, what is the average amount of time a customer has to wait to get a demo after they want one? It's more than a week. Across the industry, it's more than a week. In some cases, it's more than 2 weeks. Well, first of all, is that a good customer experience? No. So would you rather deliver no demo or some demo that they can interact with? And then the other thing is, we're not about eliminating the personal experience. Demo automation isn't designed for that. It's really about driving a more effective personal experience when you have it. So imagine if the prospect says, hey, I'd really like to see a demo. And the account executive says, oh, absolutely. If you'd like, I can send you an interactive video demo right after this call. And they're like, oh, perfect. And then how about if we set up a time with our sales engineer to dive deeper after you watch that in a few days? Great. Well, when do you think you're going to watch that video demo? Oh, I'll probably watch it the next couple of days. Great. Well, let's set an appointment for next week with the sales engineer. Well, imagine how that conversation goes with the sales engineer if they've already watched an interactive video demo. Right. Then you dive into actual consulting rather than, let me show you how all this works and so on. So it's a really valid question because we all like that personal touch. The other thing I'll just end with on that question is that research show that a lot of buyers prefer digital methods of self-education over live method, partly because they get to do it on their own. They don't have that pressure while they're learning, and then they can go ask more questions later. So in my opinion, it actually increases the customer experience. It doesn't decrease it.
And Showpad, we did a lot of the Age of the Empowered Buyer and talked to Gardner and Forrester about the research that they were doing. So I really do like that touch. And even in products like Showpad, where you share content out to somebody, you can get the analytics to see what they're looking at. And as a pre-sales professional, if I sent 3 case studies and they were focusing on one, when we had that follow-up conversation, I knew exactly what I wanted to talk about.
It's the same kind of concept. Exactly.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, Garin, about this. Where does demo automation fit and where does it not necessarily fit?
And to really understand where it fits, you have to categorize your demos into different types of demos and align them with the buying process. Because if you just think of the demo as the demo in general, well, that becomes difficult because demo automation does not belong in every situation. If you look at the 6 different demo types, which we categorize as vision demo, micro demo, sort of the standard discovery qualifying demo, the deep dive technical demo, the closing demos, and the FAQ demos, right? If you understand all those, then you can say, well, which of these strictly can only be done by sales engineers? In my opinion, that one is the deep dive technical demo. And of course, any consulting that goes along with that. But all of the others are potential candidates for demo automation. The early vision demo, the micro demo, the standard harbor cruise demo, even closing demos, which closing demos are just questions that come up during the final decision that buyers are making when they're trying to reduce risk. Does it integrate with this? How does it handle GDPR, et cetera, et cetera? Right. If you have these demos that you can just send out, they don't need a sales engineer usually to educate them on all those things. They may have a few follow-up questions, which the sales engineer needs to answer. But really, it's about understanding the different demo types, where they belong with the buying process, and then deciding which of these demo types is required for sales engineers to do, and which could be automated or even delegated in some fashion to the sales team.
Garin, this has been wildly beneficial. I've really appreciated this conversation. I always joke, we have a podcast and I have a bunch of notes and like stars next to them. It's like, I got to go follow up, do some research. So really appreciate your time on this. Before I let you go today, I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, what is your favorite thing about the pre-sales role?
The thing I love about the pre-sales role is just consulting. I think every sales engineer is in it to provide a solution and see the solution get results. There's something really gratifying about making a connection with people, understanding their problem, and then seeing something that you recommend yield the results that you want. I mean, there's intellectual benefits to it. It's kind of like a puzzle. Then there's just the emotional, social connection that happens there. So that's what I love about it the most.
That's great. The second question is, what advice do you have for people who are thinking about exploring demo automation?
I think the thing to think about is if you keep doing what you're currently doing, is it going to get you the results you need long term? And then, going back to that question, if you could scale your organization, again, increase productivity with existing headcount by 30% or more, what would that do? What would the sales engineers use that time for? I think there's no shortage to the answer to that question for most people.
Garin, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Every time we talk, I always learn something new and give me some good research. So thanks again for your time. Awesome to see what Consensus is doing. And thanks for being part of the PreSales Collective.
Thanks, James. It's great to be on the show.
See you next time.
See ya.
All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I always enjoy talking to Garin. I think his insights are phenomenal. The depth of his research is fantastic. I learn something new every time I talk to him. For me, there's a lot of things that Garin talks about that align with a lot of my values in pre-sales, especially around buyer enablement, customer centricity. As buying is changing, we need to be catering our sales process slightly to our buyers to make buying easier, get them across the line. Now, making the buying process easier seems like it's falling on pre-sales. In pre-sales, we should have the customer at the center of everything that we do, everything that we propose. So it looks like it's becoming pre-sales job to make buying easier, building that trust, not necessarily wearing that sales hat. So you're building continuity with your customers, with your prospects. One of the things that Garin said that really has me thinking is scale is defined as exponential results from existing resources. I don't know about you, but I've really never looked at scale that way. And when you look at it in that term or with that definition, it is really interesting to think about pre-sales resources as it exists to exponential results. And one of the things that's top of mind in our industry is really demo capacity and understanding what key activities are. Like, what do you really want your pre-sales team to be doing? And alternatively, what do you not want them to be doing? What is taking up too much time, too much effort? I love that Garin talked about the 6 demo topics. I thought that was really interesting. And one of the things that he talked about from a high level was strategy really means trade-offs. What are you trading off when it comes to actual strategy? I thought that was really interesting and resonated with me. A book Garin mentioned was Roy Vaden, Procrastination on Purpose. I don't know. When I heard that title, I thought, hey, I know some managers in my career who've done that. Thought that was a good book title. I've done some research on it. Looks like it's a really impactful book. So check that out. And at the end of the day, we need to be thinking about how pre-sales can help our customers, our teams, our organizations overall reach their potential. I really liked that. And I thought that part of today's episode was really impactful. Okay, pre-sales. One of the things that Garin did do when it comes to scaling pre-sales is he wrote a 25-page guide called Scaling Pre-sales and Strategy for Driving Pre-sales Productivity Without Increasing Headcount. You can actually find that and download that at goconsensus.com. Thanks for listening to today's episode. As always, like, share, and let your friends know about the podcast. If you have any feedback, let me know. Otherwise, see you next week.